I always believed that if you worked hard and treated people with respect, life would find a way to be fair. That was how my parents raised me, and that was how I lived every day of my 40 years working at the same manufacturing company I started when I was just 19. Bright-eyed and hopeful, it wasn't glamorous work, but it was honest. I operated machines, packed boxes, and sometimes stayed late just to make sure everyone else could go home on time. I was proud of what I did. I didn't need fancy titles or expensive clothes. My satisfaction came from knowing I had earned every dollar through effort and honesty. The people around me changed over the years. Young faces came and went. New supervisors arrived with ideas and computers replacing the rhythm of human hands. But I stayed steady. I wasn't the fastest anymore, but I was dependable. The younger ones called me Miss Maggie. Even though I told them not to, it made me smile secretly, though. One cold Thursday morning, everything started to shift. The new plant manager, Mr. Collins, was a tall man with slicked hair and a clipboard always in hand. He walked through the aisles like a judge, inspecting everything with a frown. He didn't know the workers' names yet, but he knew the numbers, how many boxes packed per hour, how many minutes spent per task, and in his eyes, numbers were everything. A week later, he called me into his office. The air inside was cold, like the fluorescent lights above. He didn't offer a chair. He just looked at me and said, "Maggie, your output has dropped 20% in the last 3 months. We can't afford inefficiency." I felt a lump in my throat. I tried to explain that the new machine had been misfiring and slowing down the process, but he barely listened. He said bluntly, "We can't make exceptions. You've had a good run here, but we need people who can keep up." I stood there frozen, hearing my years of loyalty crumble in one sentence. When I walked out of that office carrying a small box of my things, my heart felt like it had been torn open. I had given this place my youth, my energy, and more than a few sleepless nights, and now I was just gone. I remember standing outside in the cold wind, not knowing where to go. I didn't want to cry, but the tears came anyway, quietly and slow. The next few weeks were hard. I tried applying for new jobs, but no one wanted a 60-year-old woman who moved slower than the machines they use now. I picked up small cleaning work at a local diner and sometimes helped an elderly neighbor with her groceries. It wasn't much, but it kept me busy. Still at night, I would sit by my small kitchen table and think about that company, about how easily they had erased me. One afternoon, about 2 months later, I got a call from someone I didn't recognize. It was my old coworker, James. He sounded nervous. "Maggie," he said, "I need to tell you something. They fired you for being slow, but it turns out one of the supervisors had been stealing from the inventory for months, and he used your low output numbers to cover it up." My heart stopped. "What are you saying?" I asked. He sighed. "The new manager found out yesterday. They're in a panic. They know you weren't the problem. You were the scapegoat." I sat in silence for a long time. After that, I felt anger, sadness, and something else rising in me, something I hadn't felt in months: pride. The truth always has a way of surfacing even when people try to bury it. 2 days later, the phone rang again. It was Mr. Collins. His voice was softer. "This time, Maggie, we owe you an apology. We discovered that your performance reports were manipulated. We'd like to ask if you would consider coming back to work." I didn't answer right away. I let the quiet stretch on. I thought about all those years, all those times I stayed late to help others while no one helped me back. Finally, I said calmly, "I appreciate the offer, but I'm not sure I can trust that place anymore." He sounded almost desperate. "We'll give you a raise. We'll make things right." I smiled a little and said, "I don't want a raise. I just wanted to be treated fairly. You took that away from me." That night I didn't sleep much. I thought about whether I should return. Part of me wanted to show them what integrity looked like. The other part wanted to move forward somewhere new, somewhere that saw me for who I was, not just what I could produce per hour. The next morning I made my decision, and it was one that would change more than just my own life. That morning I woke up before sunrise. The sky outside my small window was a pale shade of blue, and the streets were quiet except for the sound of a lone truck passing by. I sat with my cup of coffee, letting the steam warm my hands. I thought about everything that had happened, the years I gave, the way they dismissed me, and the sudden call asking me to return. The bitterness had begun to fade, replaced by something stronger, something steadier. I realized that I had a choice. For the first time in years. I didn't have to wait for someone else to decide my worth. I took out an old notebook I used to write in back when I first started at the company. I had written goals, dreams, and reminders to myself, simple things like keep your head up or always do what's right. I flipped through the yellowed pages and stopped on one line I had written years ago when I was younger and full of hope. It said, "The work you do will never define you, the heart you carry will." I closed the notebook slowly and smiled. That was my answer. Instead of calling Mr. Collins back right away, I put on my coat and walked down to the local shelter. I had been helping there on weekends, folding clothes and serving meals. They were always short on volunteers. The director, Miss Angie, greeted me with a hug and asked if I could help in the back room sorting donations. I nodded and spent the next few hours working quietly, surrounded by boxes and laughter, and the warmth of people who gave because they cared, not because they had to. Later that afternoon, as I was about to leave, Miss Angie called me over. She said, "Maggie, I heard what happened at your old job. You know, we could use someone steady like you here." I laughed softly and said, "I'm not as fast as I used to be." She smiled and said, "That's all right. You have heart, and that's worth more than speed." That night, when I got home, I found a small envelope in my mailbox. It was from the company. Inside was a formal letter of apology signed by Mr. Collins himself, along with a handwritten note. It said, "You were right, Maggie. We were wrong. Please come back. We need people like you." I held the paper for a long time, my hands trembling slightly. Then I placed it on the table and whispered softly, "No, you don't need me. You need to learn what it means to value people before they're gone." The next day I went to the diner where I worked part-time. The owner, a cheerful man named George, smiled when he saw me. He said, "Maggie, you always bring light into this place." I told him about the letter and how they wanted me back. He listened quietly, then said, "Sometimes the best thing we can do is move forward, not backward." I thought about that all day as I poured coffee and wiped tables. The customers smiled and called me sweetheart, and for the first time in months I felt truly at peace. But life has a way of bringing things full circle. About a week later, a young reporter from the local newspaper came into the diner. She had a camera hanging around her neck and a notebook in her hand. She sat down at the counter and ordered coffee. Then she looked at me and said, "Excuse me, are you Margaret Thompson, the woman who was fired unfairly from the factory?" I blinked in surprise. "How do you know about that?" She smiled. "I am doing a story about workers who've been mistreated and the changes happening in the industry. I heard your company reached out to you again." I hesitated, but something inside told me to speak. I told her everything quietly and honestly about my years of work, my dedication, and how easily I was cast aside. When I slowed down, she listened intently, scribbling notes. Her eyes softened as I finished, and she said, "People need to hear this. Your story could help others." A week later, my face was on the front page of the community paper. The headline read, "Local Worker Stands Up for Dignity After Unfair Firing." Underneath was a photo of me standing outside the diner, smiling faintly with my apron still on. The article described my decades of service and the courage it took to refuse going back. It talked about respect and humanity, and the need to treat people with kindness no matter their age or speed. The story spread further than I could have imagined. People from all over town began coming to the diner, not to pity me, but to thank me for standing up for what was right. One afternoon, an older man stopped me and said, "My daughter went through something like this. You gave her courage to speak up." I didn't know what to say except thank you. And then one day the phone rang again, but this time it wasn't Mr. Collins. It was the company's owner, a man named Mr. Porter. I hadn't spoken to him in years. He said, "Maggie, I read the article. I didn't know how unfairly you were treated. We've made changes since then. We've started a new policy to protect workers and offer training for older employees. And we'd like to invite you to join our community board to represent workers' voices." I was stunned. I sat there silent for a moment. Then I said softly, "I'll think about it, sir." He said, "Take your time, Maggie. You've earned that." That night I walked outside and looked up at the stars. The air was cool and calm. I realized that sometimes losing something you thought defined you opens a door to something much bigger. I wasn't just a worker anymore. I had become a voice for others who felt unseen, and I didn't need a title or paycheck to know my worth. The next morning I sat with my coffee staring at the letter from Mr. Porter. I must have read it 5 times. I could feel the weight of it in my hands. It wasn't about going back to the factory floor. It was about something different. A seat at the table where decisions were made. A small voice inside me whispered that maybe this was my chance to turn pain into purpose. I didn't say yes right away. I spent a few days thinking, walking to the park in the morning, sitting on the old wooden bench near the pond, watching ducks glide over the water. I thought about all the people I had worked with over the years, some still there, some long gone. I thought about the quiet ones who never spoke up, afraid of losing their jobs, about the older women who hid their aches and pains so no one would call them weak. I thought about how I had once believed being humble meant staying silent, but now I knew sometimes courage meant speaking softly but firmly. On Friday, I called Mr. Porter. I told him I would accept his offer, but only on one condition. I wanted to be free to speak honestly about what needed to change. He agreed without hesitation. He said, "Maggie, that's exactly why we need you." The following week, I walked back into the same building I had left months ago. The same smell of oil and metal hung in the air. The sound of machines filled the background, but something felt different this time. I wasn't an employee anymore. I was a voice and a reminder that people were more than their productivity. When I stepped through the main hallway, some of the workers saw me and their eyes widened. I could hear whispers, "Is that Maggie? She's back." The young man at the front desk smiled and said, "Welcome home, Miss Thompson." It made my throat tighten a little. Mr. Porter met me in the conference room. He was older now, his hair completely white, but his eyes kind. He shook my hand and said, "Maggie, it's good to see you again." I nodded and said, "It's good to be back. But I'm not here to look backward. I'm here to make sure what happened to me never happens to anyone else again." We spent hours talking about new training programs, fair evaluation systems, and support for aging workers. I shared stories, names, faces, people who had been treated like numbers for too long. He listened and took notes. It was the first time I had ever seen someone in power really listen, not just to respond, but to understand. At the end of the meeting, he said, "Maggie, would you like to see the floor again?" I hesitated and nodded. We walked down the hall, and I could feel my heart beating faster. The machines roared just as they always had. I saw the same gray walls, the same flickering lights, but this time the workers smiled when they saw me. Some waved, others called my name. I waved back and tears filled my eyes. I spotted James, the co-worker, who had called me when the truth came out. He walked up with a big grin and said, "Well, look who's back in charge." I laughed and said, "Oh no, not in charge, just here to help." He said, "It's good to see you, Maggie. People still talk about you every day. You gave them hope." That evening after the meeting, I stopped by the diner for dinner. George, the owner, smiled when he saw me and said, "So you went back after all?" I nodded and said, "Sort of, but this time it's different." He poured me a cup of coffee and said, "You always find a way to turn things around, Maggie. That's something special." I smiled quietly. It wasn't something special. I thought it was just faith. The next few months were filled with small victories. The company started offering flexible schedules for older workers. They introduced mentoring programs, pairing experienced staff with younger ones, and slowly the tension that once filled the factory began to fade. There were still challenges, of course, but the atmosphere changed. People laughed again, helped each other again, trusted each other again. One afternoon, Mr. Collins approached me. He looked nervous. His voice was quiet. "Maggie, I wanted to apologize personally. I was wrong. I judged you unfairly, and I let pressure blind me." I looked at him for a moment, then smiled gently. It takes courage to admit a mistake. I said, "I forgive you, but learn from it." He nodded his eyes. "Misty, I will," he said. After that day, something shifted in me. I no longer carried the pain of what they'd done. I carried peace instead. I realized that forgiveness wasn't about forgetting. It was about freeing yourself to move forward. I had found my strength again, not through anger, but through grace. One morning, the local paper called again. They wanted to do a follow-up story. They said, "Maggie, we heard you joined the company board and started new programs for workers. We'd like to share how one woman's courage changed an entire workplace. I laughed softly. I never thought my life would be newsworthy, I said, but if it helps others, I'll do it. That story reached even further. This time, people from other cities began writing letters to me. Some were young mothers, some older workers, all saying the same thing. Thank you for showing us that it's never too late to stand up for yourself. I kept those letters in a box under my bed, each one a reminder that the smallest act of courage can ripple out further than we ever imagined it was. A few months later, when the new challenge arrived quietly, almost like a whisper at first. A young woman named Carla had just started working on the assembly line. She was quick, bright, and full of energy, but she was also outspoken. She didn't let people walk over her, and sometimes that rubbed management the wrong way. I saw a bit of my younger self in her, the fire, the pride, the unwillingness to bow when something felt wrong. One afternoon I was walking down the corridor when I overheard Mr. Collins, now the plant supervisor, arguing with Carla, his tone sharp, his words cold. He accused her of slowing down the team, even though I had seen her numbers and they were excellent. She stood her ground, trying to explain, but he cut her off. I stepped closer quietly and waited until he turned around. His expression changed when he saw me. He forced a smile. Maggie, I was just handling a small issue, he said. I looked at Carla, her eyes filled with fear. I could tell she was holding back tears. After he walked away, I asked her softly what happened. She hesitated, then said, I think he's trying to make me quit. I report things he doesn't want anyone to notice, safety issues mostly. I nodded slowly, my stomach tightened. I had seen this story before, different faces. Same injustice. That evening I went home restless. I sat by the window as the rain tapped softly on the glass. I thought about how I had promised myself to protect those who couldn't speak up. But I also knew stepping in again could stir trouble. There were people who still didn't like that I was back. Some thought I was too involved, too opinionated, but my heart wouldn't let me stay silent. The next morning I went straight to Mr. Porter's office and told him everything I said. We cannot say we value fairness and turn our backs. When someone brave speaks the truth. He listened carefully, then sighed. Maggie, you know there will be pushback from the board. I smiled gently, then let them push. I've been through worse. He laughed quietly, shaking his head, and said, You never changed, Maggie, and that's why we need you. We launched an internal review quietly. At first, it didn't take long for the truth to come out. Carla was right. There were safety concerns that had been ignored for months, and her reports had been buried. When the findings became public, management had no choice but to act. Mr. Collins was asked to step down. When the announcement came through, Carla came to see me. She was crying, but smiling at the same time. She said, Thank you, Maggie. I thought I was alone. I reached for her hand and said, You never were alone, sweetheart. You just needed to see that someone was willing to stand beside you. That night, I went home feeling a strange mix of exhaustion and peace. I sat on my porch with a blanket around my shoulders, looking at the stars. I thought about how life has a way of circling back. The things we once suffered through become the lessons we use to protect others. I realized then that maybe that was the real reason I had been brought back to that factory, not to prove myself, but to help others find their voices. Over the next few weeks, Carla and I became close. She reminded me of my daughter, full of questions about life and work and dreams. She told me about her mother who worked double shifts at a diner and her little brother who wanted to be an engineer. I listened and smiled quietly. It felt good to care again, to guide someone to believe again that kindness could still live in a place built around machines. One evening, the company hosted a small event to celebrate the changes we had made: safer procedures, fairer reviews, and better communication between workers and management. Everyone gathered in the cafeteria, decorated with simple white lights. There was laughter and music, and for the first time in years, the air felt light. Mr. Porter gave a short speech. He said this company once lost its way, but it found its heart again because of people like Maggie Thompson. The room filled with applause, and I tried to hold back tears. I didn't want to cry in front of everyone, but I couldn't help it. After the event, I stepped outside for a moment. The night was cool, the sky clear. I looked up and whispered, Thank you to the heavens. Maybe it was to God, maybe to life, maybe to every person who ever believed in me. I didn't know, but I felt it deeply in my chest, a quiet gratitude that wrapped around me like a soft coat. A few days later, I received another letter, this one from an old co-worker named Denise. She had moved away years ago. She wrote, "I saw your story in the paper again, Maggie. I just wanted to tell you that because of you, I finally stood up for myself at my new job. They treated me unfairly, but I remembered your strength and I found mine, thank you." I held that letter close to my heart and smiled. I realized that what I had built wasn't a career or a title. It was a legacy of courage and compassion that was worth more than any paycheck or promotion ever could be. It was early Sunday morning when I heard the knock at my door, the kind of knock that doesn't come from a stranger. It was firm yet hesitant. I wiped my hands on my apron, thinking maybe it was Carla dropping by with some muffins again. But when I opened the door, my breath caught in my throat standing. There was my son David. He looked older, his face lined with worry and sleepless nights. The last time I had seen him, we had shouted at each other over something small that grew into something big like weeds choking the roots of love. I had told myself I had forgiven him, but seeing him there brought back every ache, every silence, every lonely night. He said softly, "Hi, Mom. I didn't know if you'd even open the door." I stared at him for a moment, then stepped aside quietly, saying, "You better come in before the neighbors start wondering why a grown man is talking to his mama from the porch." He smiled faintly and walked in, looking around as if the walls were strangers to him now. I made coffee because that's what mothers do even when their hearts are trembling. We sat at the kitchen table, the same table where he had done his homework years ago. I asked, "So what brings you here, David?" He looked down at his cup and said, "I heard about what happened at the plant. Your story was all over the local news, Mom. You really changed things. I didn't know how to reach you before. But when I saw that, I realized I had been wrong about a lot of things." For a long moment we didn't speak. The air felt heavy with years of unsaid words. Then he said, "I told you once that you embarrassed me, that you were just some old factory worker. I was ashamed of you. I thought success meant suits and big houses. But now I see what real strength looks like. It looks like you." My hands trembled. I tried to hide it by taking a sip of coffee, but tears rolled down before I could stop them. I whispered, "David, I never wanted to be your shame. I just wanted to be your mother." He reached across the table and took my hand. His grip was firm and warm like the boy I used to walk to school on cold mornings. He said, "I lost my job a few months ago. I thought I had everything together. But when things fell apart, I realized the only person I wanted to call was you. I wanted to say, 'I'm sorry, Mom. I really am.'" I looked at him and saw not the proud man who had walked away years ago, but the little boy who used to run to me after falling off his bike. I told him softly, "You don't have to apologize, son. Life has a way of humbling us and teaching us at the same time. The important thing is you came back. That's what matters." He nodded, and we sat there for hours talking about everything and nothing about life and mistakes and forgiveness. It felt like spring had quietly returned after a long winter. Later that evening, he said, "Mom, I want you to meet someone." And then a woman stepped in. She was gentle-looking with kind eyes, and she held a little girl's hand. "Mom, this is Lily, my wife, and this is Emma, your granddaughter." I gasped softly. The child had his eyes on my smile. I knelt down and said, "Hello, sweetheart." She grinned and said, "Grandma, I saw you on TV. You're famous." I laughed with tears still wet on my face. Fame never felt this good before. The house that once echoed with silence now filled with laughter again. We had dinner together, simple food, but it tasted like peace after they left. I sat on my porch again as the sun dipped low, the sky painted in gold and pink. I whispered, "Thank you, because some prayers take years to be answered. But when they finally are, they arrive gentle and complete." The following week, David called again. He asked if I could come to his office. He said he wanted me to see something. My stomach fluttered with nerves, but I agreed. The next day, I walked into his workplace. Everyone busy moving around, typing, talking on phones. When I entered the room, David stood up and said loud enough for everyone to hear, "Everyone, this is my mother, the strongest woman I know. She taught me what real work and real courage mean. For a second, I couldn't move, my eyes filled with tears. Everyone in that room stood and clapped. I wasn't famous, not in the way the world measures fame, but in that moment I felt like I had lived a full life. When we left his office, I turned to him and said softly, "You remember when you told me I embarrassed you?" He nodded, looking guilty. I smiled and said, "Well, honey, I hope I embarrassed you again today because I sure made a scene." He laughed hard, hugging me tight right there on the sidewalk. That night, as I sat alone in my kitchen, I thought about how strange and beautiful life can be. Sometimes the same hands that hurt us are the ones that come back to hold us again. Sometimes what breaks us also rebuilds us in better, stronger ways. And for the first time in many years, my heart felt completely at rest after that day at David's office. Life began to settle into something new and beautiful. It wasn't flashy or full of grand surprises. It was quiet and steady, the kind of peace that feels earned. I woke up every morning, made my coffee, and watched the sunrise spill its golden light over the little patch of garden I had behind my house. For years I had planted flowers there, but they never seemed to bloom right. Now, though, it felt different. The colors looked brighter and the air felt lighter, like my heart had finally caught up with my dreams. David started visiting more often. He'd stop by with Lily and Emma, and they'd fill the house with laughter and warmth. Emma loved to sit on my lap while I told her stories. Not about princesses or castles, but about life, about kindness, and about how courage sometimes comes in the smallest moments. She'd listen wide-eyed, and when I'd finished, she'd hug me and say, "Grandma, you're my hero." Every time she said that, something in me healed a little more. One afternoon, while I was folding laundry, my phone rang. It was James from the old factory. He said they had officially reopened under new management, and that the new owners wanted to offer me a consulting role, not to run machines, but to train the younger workers on safety, teamwork, and integrity. I laughed softly because I had never even used the word consulting in my life. But I said yes, not for the money, but because I wanted to give back. When I returned to that factory, it looked the same. Same brick walls, same echoing hallways, but it felt different. People greeted me with smiles, and some even whispered, "That's Miss Maggie, the one who stood up for herself." I spent weeks teaching the new employees that numbers don't define worth and that doing the right thing matters even when no one's watching. I told them stories of how I had once been fired for being too slow, but in truth, I had just been moving at the speed of honesty. One day, a young woman came to me after class. Her name was Hannah. She said, "Miss Maggie, I was going to quit last week. I thought I wasn't good enough for this job, but hearing your story made me stay. If you could start over at your age, maybe I can too." I hugged her tight and told her that sometimes life will try to push you out, but if you keep walking forward, you'll find a door waiting somewhere ahead. That night, as I drove home under the soft glow of the streetlights, I realized something. My story wasn't just about losing and getting back a job. It was about finding my voice. For so many years I had been quiet, believing that being humble meant staying silent. But now I knew that sometimes the bravest thing a person can do is simply speak up for themselves. Months passed, and I decided to start something new. With David's help, I opened a small community space in town. We called it Hands of Hope. It wasn't fancy, just a simple building where women could come to learn new skills, share their stories, and remind each other that it's never too late to begin again. The first night we opened, 5 women showed up. The next week, there were 10. By the end of the month, we had over 50. Every time I saw a woman walk through those doors with tired eyes but a determined heart, I saw myself years ago, the woman standing outside that factory with a box of her things and a heart full of questions. And every time I helped one of them find a new path, I felt like I was healing a part of that old pain. Then one evening, after a long day at the center, I sat on my porch with a cup of tea. The air smelled like rain, and the world felt quiet. David called and asked, "Mom, are you happy now?" I looked out at the garden where my flowers were glowing softly under the porch light, and I said, "Son, I've always been happy. I just didn't always know it." He laughed gently and said, "You're something else, Mom." I said, "No, sweetheart, I'm just someone who refused to give up." As I sat there, I thought about everything, the pain, the injustice, the loss, and the strength it took to rise again. Life has a funny way of testing us, but it also has a way of rewarding us when we hold on. Sometimes the things we think are endings are really just the first pages of a new beginning. That night, I wrote something in my journal, something I hoped Emma would read one day. I wrote, "Don't let anyone tell you your worth depends on how fast you move or how young you are. Kindness and courage don't age. They grow stronger with time. And when life pushes you down, don't just stand back up, rise with grace, because the world needs to see what strength really looks like." When I finished writing, I looked up and smiled. The rain had started falling softly, tapping the windows like a gentle lullaby. I whispered a quiet thank you for the lessons, the losses, and the love that found its way back home. Because sometimes the world may fire you for being too slow, but one day it will have to stop and notice how steady your heart has always been. The end.